Hello and welcome to my channel. And if you're joining us for the first time, where have you been? If you enjoyed true crime stories, tales of the unexpected, or macabre mysteries, then you might find it worthwhile sticking around. But before we embark upon today's case, I would encourage you please to click on the subscribe button located under this screen. Now, if we're ready, let's begin. This is the case of Susan and Christopher Edwards and the bodies in the garden. It was October 2013 when Christopher Edwards called his stepmother Elizabeth and asked her for some money. The request was somewhat surprising, given that Christopher and his wife had moved from London to France a year prior. And when asked why, Christopher made a strange admission. They'd been forced to flee the country because of a series of shocking events. By the end of that conversation, Christopher's stepmother, Elizabeth, hung up the phone and called the police. She said that they should send an investigative team directly to 2 Blenheim Close in Forest Town, Nottinghamshire. Upon excavation of the lawn at the rear of the property, 2 bodies were discovered. The remains were later identified as William and Patricia Wycherley, Christopher's mother and father-in-law, and they had been concealed there for over 15 years. This discovery was all the more disturbing because until only a few months earlier, William and Patricia, the deceased, had been alive and well, or so it had seemed. William Wycherley had married Patricia Moore in the late 1950s at Fulham Registry Office in London. Their only child, Susan, was born months later. As a teenager, Susan inherited £10,000 following the death of her grandfather. Rather than squander the money, she took her mother on a visit to Graceland, the famous home and now tourist destination of the late, great Elvis Presley. The remaining sum, which was £5,000, was put towards a house which she co-purchased with her parents in London. Now, when she was 20, Susan met and eventually married Christopher Edwards. It was said that they met via a dating agency, a fact which they both found really embarrassing and attempted to conceal without success. No big deal now, I guess, but back in the day it was seen as, I guess, kind of cringy. So it's also worth noting that Susan's father disliked Christopher from the start, which caused quite a rift in the family. Now, in 1986, Susan's parents persuaded her to sign away her half of the house, enabling them to sell it and move into 2 Blenheim Close in Forest Town. Now, Susan and Christopher didn't keep in regular contact with her parents, and they visited them only very occasionally. But during one such visit in 1992, there was a very heated argument, and when the pair left, Christopher would later claim it was the last time he ever saw the Wycherleys. The family unit was now effectively estranged. Neighbours of the Wycherleys described the couple as reserved and very reclusive, adding that it was rare they saw them at all. It was hardly surprising then that in 1997, when the Wycherleys all but disappeared, people believed that they had moved away. The truth, however, was much more sinister. On the May bank holiday of that year, Susan and Christopher visited the Wycherleys. They murdered them and they buried them under the lawn in the back garden. Accounts were different, but the Edwards version of events first stated that Susan had gone alone to her parents, and she'd woken early on Sunday morning to a loud bang, what she thought was the sound of a gunshot. She entered her parents' bedroom. She found her father slumped on the floor and her mother standing over him, holding a revolver. An argument ensued in which Susan claimed her mother admitted to having had an affair with Christopher, Susan's husband. Appalled and flying into a sudden rage, Susan then shot her mother, fled the house, and called Christopher in a panic from a phone box. Now, she didn't reveal the extent of what had actually happened, but she did return briefly to the house, wrapped the bodies in blankets, and hid them under the bed. According to the couple, they returned the following weekend, and Susan stated that they stopped to buy fish and chips en route, and it was over this fish and chip supper in the house at Blenheim Close that Susan finally told Christopher what had happened the weekend prior, and that the bodies were still upstairs. Bon appetit, I guess. For his part, Christopher said that he agreed to help Susan dispose of the bodies of his in-laws because he believed her account of the events and didn't want to throw her to the wolves by going to the police. But even more bizarre than that, Susan admitted in court that they watched the Eurovision Song Contest on television before dragging the bodies downstairs into the garden in the middle of the night. I took the liberty of looking it up, and if you're interested, 1998 was the year that Dana International won the contest for Israel. Good song. From that day on, in 1998, right until things began to unravel in 2012, the Edwards conducted an elaborate ruse to convince the world that Patricia and William Wycherley were still alive. The day after the bodies were concealed, Susan went to the bank in Mansfield and withdrew all the money that she could from her parents' joint account, in total about £40,000. She then closed those accounts and opened a new one, a joint account in her name and in her mother's name, with all the correspondence still going to the Wycherley address. During the next 15 years, the pair systematically stole money, forged signatures to continue receiving benefits, obtained control of pension plans, and took out loans and credit cards in the Wycherleys' names. Now, the total exceeded £250,000, which actually included the sale of 2 Blenheim Close in 2005, the property where the Wycherleys' remains were buried. Neighbours and relatives were told that the Wycherleys had gone travelling and were staying by the coast for health reasons. In 2007, Susan wrote to relatives explaining that her parents had sold their house and were touring Ireland because of the good air, and that they might decide to settle there permanently. In 2011, she sent a really chatty Christmas card to another relation explaining, "Yes, I realise my father travelled the world in younger years. Well, it is like he is having his second youth now, because when he does speak, now he speaks of travel and travelling. I cannot really keep up with where he's planning to settle. He and Mum like to travel in the Irish Republic, particularly. I tend to think it is a yearning for past years to do all the things that one never got around to before. But it is good to see them with such zest." They really put a lot of time and effort into maintaining this elaborate deception. So how were the couple eventually caught? Well, the Edwards might have got away with their crimes if it hadn't been for the fact that they made several ridiculous decisions. Mr. Wycherley, had he actually been alive, would have been approaching his 100th birthday. And so in 2012, the couple received a letter from the Centenarian Society, which is a prestigious organisation aimed at recognising and celebrating those people about to reach that 100th milestone birthday. So as is customary, they requested a face-to-face meeting with Mr. Wycherley. Now, this is something that I don't entirely understand, because up until now, the Edwards had been quite adept at navigating their way through requests like this, similar requests, like postponing health appointments and meetings for the Wycherleys indefinitely, while they pretended it was because they were constantly travelling. But for some reason, this time, they decided that that wouldn't work. Perhaps the Centenarian Society was particularly persistent. Nevertheless, something made the Edwards panic. They hurriedly raised £5,000 from selling books and other items. They borrowed £10,000 from Christopher's work and fled to an apartment in Lille, France. Now, after several months, they continued to struggle financially, and this leads us back to the start of the story, where Christopher rings his stepmother and asks her for some money and tells her about the events 15 years prior, that Susan had shot her mother and that they had buried her parents in the back garden. After the police had been informed and the plot behind 2 Blenheim Close excavated and the bodies retrieved and eventually identified, the investigation quickly became a murder inquiry. Detectives tried to contact the couple's daughter, Susan, but without any success. The British police force, having no jurisdiction in France, were fairly limited in their capacity to locate and question the Edwards. However, not 2 weeks after the start of the investigation, the lead detective on the case found an email sitting in his inbox, marked urgent. It was from Christopher Edwards, and stated that later that day, the couple would return to the UK and would give themselves up to the border control authorities at Lille International Train Station. He said, quote, "We would prefer to do this since my wife is already sufficiently frightened." Although it was a welcome breakthrough, the police were hesitant to instruct the French police to intercept them, because as long as the Edwards surrendered to the French authorities, then they would remain under French jurisdiction, meaning that the British police would have no power to arrest them. The lead detective on the case decided to take a risk, holding off and hoping that the couple would make the journey back to England anyway. And he instructed his team to meet the next Eurostar train arriving from Lille in London, St Pancras. This gamble paid off, and when the Edwards set foot on British soil, they were arrested and brought to Nottingham for questioning. 3 days later, on November the 2nd, Susan and Christopher Edwards appeared at Nottingham Crown Court, charged with the murder of Patricia and William Wycherley. Now, the obvious tragedy of the case was that 2 innocent people lost their lives. The irony, however, was that though the Edwards had succeeded in maintaining their deception for close to 15 years and siphoning off £250,000, they didn't even become close to paying off their debts. Conversely, when they were arrested, they owed more than £160,000. They hadn't lived a lavish lifestyle, so where had this money disappeared to? Well, the only clue investigators could find was that both Susan and Christopher seemed to have squandered thousands of pounds purchasing Hollywood memorabilia. They recovered signed photographs and pictures of actor Gary Cooper, stamps, and a £20,000 signed photograph of Frank Sinatra. In fact, in 2 years, Christopher had spent over £14,000 on mementos of movie star Gary Cooper. He was obsessed. It was discovered that Christopher had a mere £17 to his name in his bank account. Susan fared slightly better. She had £11,000, but much of this was also tied up in memorabilia. In addition, the court later heard that a series of letters Christopher believed the couple had been receiving from French actor Gérard Depardieu had actually been forged by Susan. In court, the prosecution never believed that Susan had been visiting her parents alone over the bank holiday weekend. They suggested that Christopher had also been there, and in fact, it was more than likely that he, a former gun club member, had been the one to fire the shots from the .38 revolver that had killed them both. They worked on this assumption that the Edwards had had a plan to kill the Wycherleys and pretend they were alive in order to take their money. A jury of 8 women and 4 men took just over 6 hours to unanimously convict them of murder. They each received a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. The judge commented that the couple had acted with cold calculation and meticulousness. In February 2015, Susan lost an appeal against a 25-year minimum sentence. Her barrister said the term did not take enough account of mistreatment, as she claimed to have suffered at her father's hands. He argued she suffered with a slow-burning form of provocation. He also argued that she's likely to die behind bars and will probably never see any visitors, as she had no one, except her husband, who she might never see again. Dismissing the appeal, Justice Rafferty reminded them that 15 years had elapsed since Susan had left home before she returned and murdered the people she said she hated. Christopher Edwards also launched an appeal, but his was roundly rejected on paper at an early stage, and he never pursued the matter again. And that is the disturbing story of Susan and Christopher Edwards and the bodies in the garden. In closing, one final note which may be of interest. HBO and Sky's dramatisation of the story is currently in production. And it'll be a limited 4-part series called Landscapers, which will star Olivia Colman and David Thewlis in the roles of Susan and Christopher. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. And if you like this video, don't forget to leave a comment, a like, and click the subscribe button to see future videos. Bye for now.